So, last time we went over the Curtiss P-36 Hawk, and it didn't get used much by the Americans. But it went on to become something bigger, something better, something a little more iconic. For anybody who has ever watched the Pearl Harbor movie, starring Ben Affleck, you will recognize the distinctive grin of the P-40 Warhawk. Now, the P-40 first took flight on the 14th of October 1938 and was then introduced to the United States military in 1939, with over 13,700 of them being introduced and produced during the war period. This little plane turned out to be an absolute workhorse. In fact, that number makes it the third most produced American fighter of World War II, following after the P-51 Mustang and the Republic's P-47 Thunderbolt. Allied nations who would go on to use this plane would call it either the Tomahawk for the P-40B and P-40C, and Kitty Hawk for P-40D and all later variants. This plane would see its first combat with the 112th Squadron Royal Air Force, and this unit was also among the first to feature the shark mouth logo on the front of that plane. Very iconic, stands out, everybody will recognize that image. Unfortunately, the lack of a two-speed supercharger would make it slightly less effective than the Focke-Wulf FW-190 and the Messerschmitt Bf-109 that the Germans were using in the European theater, but that didn't stop it from being widely used. No, you see, it had its highest roles in North Africa, the Southwest Pacific, and China. Now, after the war, this aircraft would go on to receive somewhat of a reputation of being a middling aircraft that was of mediocre design. But more recent research, including scrutiny of the records of the pilots who have flown those planes and have used them in combat, indicates this was not the case. The P-40 performed surprisingly well as an air superiority fighter, and even though they often suffered some heavy losses, they inflicted a heavy toll on the enemy aircraft. In fact, they inflicted such a heavy toll that over 200 Allied pilots would go on to become aces in this aircraft. The P-40 had such an advantage when it came to cost and durability that even after it was outpaced as a fighter for the United States military, they kept it around as a ground attack aircraft for a long time. P-40's original design was as a pursuit aircraft, and while it was agile at low and medium altitudes, it really did suffer when it came to higher altitudes. Medium and high speeds, it was, however, one of the most maneuverable and tightest turning monoplane designs of the war. It could outturn most, if not all, opponents it came across in the Russian and North African fronts, but in all eventuality it was outturned by the Mitsubishi A6M0 and the Ki-43 Hayabusa, also flown by the Japanese. The American volunteer group commander Claire Chennault eventually would advise against a prolonged dogfight with the Japanese fighter due to the fact that once you lost your speed, the Japanese had the advantage. However, dive acceleration was good and the dive speed was fantastic. The highest scoring P-40 ace, Clive Caldwell, who flew for the Royal Air Force, he claimed 22 of his 28.5 kills in this aircraft and said that the P-40 had almost no vices, although it was a little difficult to control when it reached its terminal velocity. The P-40 had one of the fastest maximum dive speeds of any fighter of the early war period and had fairly good high-speed handling. While the P-40 did lack such innovations as boosted ailerons or automatic leading edge slats, Its structure included a 5-spar wing, which enabled P-40s to pull high G turns and even survive mid-air collisions. In fact, some intentional ramming attacks against enemy aircraft were occasionally recorded as victories by the Desert Air Force and the Soviet Air Forces. As evidence of this plane's reliability and durability, T.R. Jacklin of the 75th Squadron Royal Air Force flew his P-40N-5 more than 200 miles after the loss of the port aileron and 25% of its wing area due to a mid-air collision with another P-40. He was missing the entire back half of almost half his wing and still managed to fly it 200 miles back and land it successfully. Not only could it take a beating, but this little sucker could fly a long ways. It was fantastic by early war standards, and was almost double that of the Spitfire and the Bf-109. Although, once again, the Zero had the advantage, as did the Ki-43 and the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. Early P-40s were armed with two 50 cal machine guns mounted in the nose, while each wing carried a .303 caliber Browning machine gun. This would later be upgraded to simply having two 50 caliber machine guns in each wing, starting with the Model D. When it came to combat performance, the pilots had a fantastic view of this aircraft, especially in North Africa. From the 3rd Squadron of the Royal Air Force, Nicky Barr once said, "I would evade being shot at accurately by pulling so much G-force that you could feel the blood leaving the head and coming down over your eyes, and you would fly like that for as long as you could, knowing that if anyone was trying to get on your tail, they were going through the same blurry vision that you had, and you might get away. I had deliberately decided that any deficiency the Kitty Hawk had was offset by aggression. And I'd done a bit of boxing. I beat much better opponents simply by just going for them, and I decided to use that in the air, and it paid off." As with many of the other videos that I've done up to this point, this aircraft was heavily involved in Pearl Harbor. In fact, it was the main United States Air Force aircraft of the time, and the P-40 squadrons that were stationed at Pearl Harbor suffered crippling losses on the ground due to the Zeros and the Ki-43 Hayabusas. During the attack on Pearl Harbor, most of the aircraft that were in the area were P-40s, and while most of them were destroyed on the ground, a few of them managed to get into the air and shoot down several Japanese aircraft, most notably flown by George Welch and Kenneth Taylor. See, George Welch and Kenneth Taylor, both second lieutenants, were coming back from a Christmas dinner and dance at a party on a rooftop in Waikiki that ended in an all-night poker game. They were still wearing their mess dress when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Welch immediately telephoned the Halewa fighter strip on Oahu's North Shore and ordered them to have two of the P-40 Tomahawk fighters prepared for takeoff. He immediately took his Buick and drove at high speed to that base to join the air battle. While climbing into their P-40s, the crew chiefs informed him that they should both disperse their planes, and Welch said, and I quote, "To hell with that." Both pilots would go take off with only the 30 caliber ammunition in their guns. The 50 cals that were nose mounted were completely empty. Welch then went on to claim 2 kills of the D-38 Val dive bombers over Uamoring mast field, and while only one of them was actually completely shot down, the second one was finished off by Ken Taylor shortly before he landed at Wheeler Field to get his 50 cal ammo loaded into his 2 cal guns. On his second sortie, Welch then went on to shoot down another Val, which was pulling up behind Ken Taylor, and then crashed into the community of Wahiawa. Then, after that, he shot down a Zero fighter about 5 miles west of Barbers Point. Both Welch and Taylor would go on to be nominated for the Medal of Honor by General Henry H. Arnold, but unfortunately, they were only awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, which is only the second highest United States Medal for Valor, which, to be granted, is no small achievement, but if we're honest, when we're looking at it from a historical perspective, these boys straight up went from partying to killing Japanese in the time it took them to drive to the airfield. These boys deserve more. Welch would go on to fly the P-39 Air Cobra, which he disliked to a major degree, and eventually, after repeated appeals to be assigned to the 80th Fighter Squadron, which flew P-38s, he was granted a transfer. Between June 21st and September 2nd, while flying a P-38, Welch would then shoot down 9 more Japanese aircraft. 2 Zeros, 3 Ki-61s, 3 Ki-43s, and 1 Ki-46. Unfortunately, malaria ended up being the end of his World War II career, though it did not take him out of the fight entirely, as he would go back to become a test pilot. Though test pilot was not his final title. He would then, after World War II had concluded, go on to become an instructor during the Korean War, where he reportedly downed several enemy MiG-15s while quote-unquote supervising his students. Welch's kills were considered in disobedience of direct orders for him to not engage at all, and the credits for those kills were then distributed among his students. At the end of the day, this guy just wanted to shoot down whoever was the problem. And by golly, he did it. After the Korean War, he would then return to test piloting, this time specifically the F-100 Super Sabre. Unfortunately, his plane disintegrated during a 7G pullout at Mach 1.55 and crashed. When he was found, Welch was still in the ejection seat, critically injured. He was evacuated by helicopter, but unfortunately was pronounced dead on arrival at the Air Force Hospital. He was then buried in Arlington National Cemetery. But he's not the only one who did some fantastic things with a P-40. In fact, as you may recall, over 200 people earned their ace on this aircraft. And one of those people was Philip E. Colman, also known as Casey. Born in Roanoke, Virginia in 1921, Philip Colman graduated from Jefferson High School in 1940. He enlisted in the United States Air Corps the next year and was accepted for flight training. He would go on to graduate, and then, upon graduating, would immediately be put to work towing air targets so that other people could learn how to shoot down aircraft. He was then sent to the fighter section, where he flew as a test pilot, flying the British Spitfire, the German Bf-109, and the Japanese Oscar. All of this led to one fateful day where he was assigned his first combat assignment. Once he was assigned this assignment, he was loaded up onto the British ship HMT Rohna, and he was set to sail. In fact, he was put aboard a ship, as I mentioned, the Rohna, which was a coal-burning passenger cargo ship owned by the British India Steamship Company and requisitioned by the British government for use as a troop transport. This ship had mostly an Indian crew, although it did have an 18-man British defensively equipped merchant ship detachment. Also on board were 1,981 United States soldiers. The United States soldiers were mostly destined for India to build the B-29 bomber bases, and were mostly from the 853rd Engineer Battalion, but our man was among the few from the fighter squadrons. As they sailed along on their voyage from Algeria to India, 30 Luftwaffe bombers, mostly HE-177As, attacked in two major waves. 4 of the Free French Spitfire fighters put up a fairly good defense and were later followed up by several of the British's RAF fighters. But the Germans dropped many bombs, and while they dropped them in horizontal mode, they absolutely missed. When bombs are dropped in horizontal mode, especially during World War II, unguided bombs specifically, the lack of success was predictable. But the HE-177s also happened to be dropping 42 of the HS-293 radio-controlled rocket-boosted glide bombs, which when dropped from about 4,600 feet, achieved their high speed with a 10-second burn by a liquid-fueled rocket motor, and was designed to be used against unarmored ships. Even though there were many aircraft involved in this attack, the extensive anti-aircraft fire from the convoy and prolific use of smoke and on-water maneuvering all served to mess up the Germans' aim. Additionally, at least 6 of the guided bombs were successfully drawn off target by the new radio jamming equipment that some of the convoy's escorts carried. The German operators were required to keep eyes both on the bomb and on the ship that they were targeting throughout the bomb's entire flight, or else that bomb was likely to miss, as while it was radio controlled, it was not guided outside of visually. So he could send the controls, but he had to see where he needed to send it to in order to be able to send those controls. Now, the Germans did pay heavily for this attack. 4 of the HE-117s were shot down, one of them even carrying the group's commander aboard them, and 3 more made it back to base, but were not flyable afterwards. Several other German aircraft were shot down, and this was all coordinated through anti-aircraft fire. Even the Rohna, a converted ship, was contributing to these kills through her own anti-aircraft weapons that had been hastily mounted to the ship. Unfortunately, at about 5:15 in the evening, Rohna was hit by an HS-293, the aforementioned radio-guided bomb. In fact, this was the only radio-guided bomb of the 42 dropped that scored purchase. Although several others managed to get near misses, this bomb hit Rohna's port side, penetrated deep into the ship on a delayed fuse, and blew holes all over the starboard side, quickly causing the ship to list starboard. About 300 of the Army troops on board were killed in the blast and never even made it off the ship. The bomb hit about 15 inches above the waterline, but nevertheless the starboard holes flooded the engine room, knocking out all of the electrical power, including the pumps, and set the number 4 hold on fire. This blast also would destroy 22 lifeboats and would go on to buckle plates on the port side so that even the boats that were not damaged on the port side couldn't even be launched. Ultimately, for this ship, which was carrying over 2,000 people, only 8 lifeboats could be launched. Now, this is not entirely because of damage to the lifeboats. This was an old ship. This was a ship that had been seized for transport by the British. So part of the problem when it came to the lifeboats was that This thing had been through some stuff. It had been around for a while, and the lifeboats were rusted to their mounts and could not be launched. So even though maybe they could have been theoretically launched if it weren't for that problem, only 8 lifeboats got launched. 8 is not enough for 2,000 people. Now granted, 300 people are already dead from the blast. That's still 1,700 plus people that you're trying to fit onto 8 lifeboats. Although 101 rafts of various kinds and condition went into the water, most of the army troops on board that boat ended up having to swim. However, the anti-aircraft guns continued to fire even as the ship was sinking. Some 90 minutes after the ship actually was hit, the final group of people abandoned the ship, including Captain T.J. Murphy, the ship's Australian master. Now, this ship was a part of a convoy, and as such, they had a pre-planned response in the event that a ship was lost. The specific ships in the convoy were supposed to conduct rescue operations, and the ship assigned to this was the USS Pioneer, under the command of Leroy Rogers. He immediately swung into action despite continuing German bomb and strafing attacks. The Pioneer had barely missed being hit by a bomb themselves, and had put up such a volume of anti-aircraft fire that she was thought to be on fire. They fired so many bullets that they thought their own ship had caught on fire because they were firing so much. 2 other ships would also drop behind the convoy to assist with the downed ship as well, the Clan Campbell and the Holcomb. Due to the cold of the water and the size of the waves, given the windstorm that also just happened to be occurring at the same time, it was not possible to launch boats from these ships immediately, and the rescuers were essentially just racing the clock, hoping that they would not be beaten by the onset of hypothermia. The crew of the Pioneer mounted a very aggressive and very valiant effort to recover the crew of the Rohna. The 122-man crew dove into the water, some tied with ropes and some not, to assist soldiers who were quickly becoming too weak to climb ropes or cargo nets. Horrifically, and unfortunately, this was quite dangerous, as a number of the soldiers were killed by the Pioneer's props or were sucked under the ship as she heaved up and down in the high waves on the sea that night. Even with such high risks to their sailors, Pioneer's crew continued to bring people in, bringing a total of 606 survivors on board. This act of bravery brought so many people on board that the Pioneer became top-heavy. Despite this risk, the Pioneer's skipper ordered the use of searchlights and continued searching and rescuing survivors until no more could be found in the dark, and there was literally no more room to bring any more aboard. The other ships in the area also brought people back out of the water. In total, and some of these died after the fact, but the United States would lose 1,050 people to this shipwreck. This was the largest loss of life in the United States military's history due to the sinking of a ship. And our boy, Phil Colman, lived through it. Now, unfortunately, as heroic as the actions of those aboard the Pioneer were, the United States military realized that the German government really should not know that their bombs that were radio guided were incredibly effective when they hit. So, unfortunately, this entire incident was classified. Not only was it classified, but it was classified for a long time. So long, in fact, that veterans who survived this wreck had difficulty proving that their injuries were service-related because there was no evidence that they had been through anything, because the sinking of this ship just didn't exist in public record. This was classified for so long that it took until the passage of House Concurrent Resolution number 408 in October of the year 2000 before it was completely declassified. Only at this point did the sailors aboard Rohna and USS Pioneer receive the United States government's recognition for their courage and sacrifice during this event. Of the 4.5 million United States troops transported to Europe during the war, 3,604 were lost, including the 1,050 on Rohna. That makes over a quarter of our naval losses of life due to this one event, and it was classified until the year 2000. But I'm getting somewhat sidetracked here because I'm here to talk about Philip Colman, and I've been talking about the sinking of the Rohna. So Philip Colman was among those rescued aboard the Pioneer. He would survive this and then would immediately be transferred to his next combat assignment. This combat assignment was for the Chinese-American Composite Wing, where he flew 86 missions in the P-40, escorting B-25s and providing air-ground support for the Chinese Army. During this time, he shot down 5 Japanese Zero fighters, with an additional 2 probables and 5 others damaged. That wasn't enough for him, though. After World War II, he then went back to the United States and decided to join the 116th Fighter Group in the Georgia Air National Guard. With the onset of the Korean War, his unit was then ordered to active duty, and he was transferred to Japan. In 1952, Colman was then assigned to the 335th Fighter Interceptor Squadron, 4th Fighter Interceptor Wing at Kimpo. He began equipping and training as the pilot of an F-86. And as operations officer of the 116th Wing, he then would go on to shoot down another several aircraft in the Korean War. Unfortunately, he did not shoot down enough to be recognized as a Korean War ace, but between the victories that he gained during World War II and the victories that he gained in Korea, he was indeed a double ace. After Korea, he would return to the United States and the Georgia National Guard, retiring in 1958 as a lieutenant colonel. He would eventually pass away on April 28th, 2011. With all the hubbub that surrounds aces and double aces, it is important to note that he was a double ace of 2 wars, not just the one, and is in a very small group of people who is achieved that honor. So, I know this is supposed to be a P-40 video, and while he did earn his ace in the P-40, it does kind of feel like I have strayed from that specific focus. This is not because the P-40 is objectively uninteresting. I mean, it ended up generating over 200 aces, but sometimes stories take us in places that we did not expect. So, remember, everyone around you has a story, and most of them probably deserve to be told. So ask your grandparents, ask your parents, find out what their stories are. It's important that things be passed on, because at the end of the day, too many things are forgotten to time. So, this is Demonic Maelstrom, signing off.